Why is Qatar both creating a vast empire of wealth and influence and also putting all of that at risk by often aligning itself with the Muslim Brotherhood, both in the Middle East and in Europe, and even with the related terrorist groups? The power they have built up is far beyond what is needed to simply hedge their bets, as some surmise. The only way this paradox makes sense is if these are not two conflicting goals, but one unified grand strategy. They go hand in hand, but at arm's length. The reason for Qatar to build up its power is to facilitate the Muslim Brotherhood. Its spread in the Middle East and in Europe. And the spread of the Muslim Brotherhood in the Middle East and Europe is also there to legitimize Qatar's power. In this video, I'm going to show you how these apparent contradictions fit together and how they all flow from one foundation, and how that foundation is a marriage between power, Islam, and pragmatism, that it is a single, unified, and terrifyingly coherent master plan, all of which facilitated with their own novel form of Islamic jurisprudence. And this is their way to conquer the West. Not by the sword, but by lulling it to sleep. Qatar has long been in the news, and the material I'm providing here, most of it shouldn't be new. But the synthesis which I will show you, including a deep look at the theological workings behind Qatar's action, I think at the very least are practically unknown in the West. This is causality. The news reports the symptoms, we provide the diagnosis. My name is Shalom Bar-Eretz. I have a background in international relations, political science, and sociology. I am also a major in the IDF Reserves, and I have learned a thing or two about theology in my day. In this video, we are going to look at Qatar from a non-sensationalist point of view, even though the conclusions are in fact quite sensational. Everything here is backed up, and I think it is well-founded. It might even be said that what I will present to you here should be obvious and well known. In order to not rehash old ground, I'm going to consider the details of Qatari power and the influence they have as well known, and I won't get into it here. Others have done this already, and I recommend the Qatar paper specifically for their relation with the Muslim Brotherhood. The claim I am making here is simple and straightforward. It can be summed up in three logical points. Qatar has continually striven to increase its power in the world and in the West. Islam in general, and the Qatari Islam in particular, has a main goal of dawah, or proselytizing and converting the world to Islam. Qatar has used its power to further the goal of dawah and uses dawah to legitimize its power. That is it. To refute this thesis, you only need to refute either one of the first 2 points or state why the third point doesn't logically follow and isn't backed up by evidence. In this video, I will be using Arabic terms, and while I have tried to get the pronunciation correct, I am sure it will be lacking, so apologies on that beforehand. Now, I'm not the first to point out the contradictions in Qatar's foreign policy, but they are usually solved using lazy explanations. Qatar is hedging its bets. Oh, it's opportunistic. They're just buying influence everywhere. But none of those explanations explain the sheer scale of their influence. You don't spend hundreds of billions of dollars in the US and in Europe. You don't build large, grand mosques around the world. And you don't fund universities and Islamic departments in the West. And you don't do all of that while hosting the World Cup and having the largest US military base in the Middle East, and by entrenching yourself in every country possible simply to hedge a bet. When you hedge a bet, you are making small, risk-averse moves. Qatar is not risk-averse. They are all in with everything they do. They are everywhere on the global stage, and doing that is itself exposure. That amount of exposure is itself a form of weakness. If their goal was mere survival, as some have proposed, Qatar would be much better off quietly aligning itself with one or another different military protector. Or they could maintain a quiet neutrality and not step on anyone's toes. It wouldn't be trying to play all sides at once. It also wouldn't blatantly drive the ire of its most powerful neighbors, such as Saudi Arabia, by being one of the main sponsors of their biggest ideological enemies, The Muslim Brotherhood. No, quiet pragmatism and hedging their bets is not the path Qatar has chosen. This suggests this proves their goal, is not mere survival. Survival is the floor of their ambitions. Something much higher is driving this entire operation. You do not do all of that for just survival. You don't even do all of that to simply accumulate power. They seem to be bent on gaining as much power as possible, everywhere. But why? I put forward that this is an ideological, it is a theological driven process. That is the core thesis of this video. And here in this video, we are going to pull back the geopolitical veil and expose the theological blueprint that can convert every contradiction that the Qataris have undertaken into a clear step along the path towards their goal. Qatar's primary objective is to advance their own version of political Islam, one which is aligned to, but not subjugated to, the Muslim Brotherhood. Their goal is a quiet global transformation that can both convert the West and control the Muslim heartlands. They recognize that for over a millennium, the sword has failed to conquer the West. Now, they are placing their bets that the West doesn't need to be defeated. They can simply be bought. And every contradictory action, from hosting CENTCOM to funding Hamas, is justified under their new, novel religious code. Everything is permitted. Alliances, counter-alliances, anything and everything that builds their power. I am not making the claim that Qatari moves are driven by a singular, linear plan of action, which was written far in advance. No. It is driven by a consistent ideology and modus operandi. This means that they do not need to be thinking 10 steps ahead, only judging every step as to whether they will gain power and influence through it. The theological framework anchoring all of this was clearly laid out by Qatar's recently deceased theological partner, Yusuf al-Qaradawi. His decrees and fatwas offer a novel jurisprudence, which itself has been influenced by and molded in order to turn all of Qatar's actions into a religious obligation. This framework even has a name, Wasatiyah, translated as the middle way. This is an old term, but in his hand, it has become the blueprint for action. This is first and foremost present in his interpretation of the law of priorities, the Fiqh al-Awliyat, where any pragmatic action, such as hosting a military base or purchasing Western assets, is not forbidden because it could be seen as impure, but instead a necessary and justified step. The goal of every such action is to accumulate power, legitimacy, and international immunity, which will ultimately be directed towards advancing the greater, purer goal, ideological entrenchment and global transformation. Now, I know some will quickly label this as conspiracy theory, but I think it is best to ask a simple question. Why wouldn't they do this if it is in their power? Islam teaches that it is the duty to spread Islam throughout the world, dawah. It is apparent and simple. It is almost the case that if you are saying they are not doing this, you have to simultaneously make the claim that they are bad Muslims. In addition, most false conspiracies try to claim that the actor is all-powerful. I'm not saying that here. I'm saying that they are walking a tightrope, and they can even easily fall. Also, conspiracies are built on secret networks. What I'm saying here is that they have a vast network, but it's not secret. Qatar is doing almost everything out in the open. Over the course of the video, I will expose this blueprint. We will dive deeper into how Qatar's powers build up. Then we will see how the ultimate plan is summed up in one of the most famous quotes by Qaradawi himself. What remains then is to conquer Rome. This means that Islam will come back to Europe for the third time after it was expelled from it twice. Conquest through dawah. That is what we hope for. We will conquer Europe. We will conquer America. Not through the sword, but through dawah. That is what Qaradawi said, and that is what Qatar plans. So come with me on this journey behind the veil. See what the plan really is, and come to your own conclusions on whether we should welcome this or not. I am not objective on this. The analysis here will be objective, but I have my own subjective take. Since Qatar's power and influence is well documented, we will first look at how they got there and the ideological reasonings behind it before we start looking at how the pieces of Qatari power fit into that puzzle. Qatar started on this path around 1995 when Sheikh Hamad Al Thani seized power from his father in a swift, bloodless palace coup. Now, it could be said that it started earlier, as he already had much power in the kingdom that his father had delegated to him, and that the Muslim Brotherhood was already present. The coup happened after his father tried to rein him in. He simply grabbed power for himself while his father was abroad. Now, Sheikh Hamad Al Thani wanted to revolutionize Qatar. He wanted to bring liquefied natural gas that Qatar has now become famous for to the mass market. And this would bring in money, and it would inevitably westernize the country. This was thought by conservatives in the country, including his father, that it could potentially cause a lot of tension with Qatar's religious foundation. For they practice a form of Wahhabism in Qatar, which is the same puritanical school that has defined Saudi Arabia. And I won't get too much into the detail here between the differences between the branches of Wahhabism, and the Qatari branch is a little bit more moderate, but essentially it is the same school. But let's put that to the side for a moment. The coup wasn't without its trials. Less than a year later, his father tried to stage a counter-coup. Allegedly, he didn't do this on his own, but rather had the help of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Egypt. And even though this counter-coup failed, some have pointed to it as the catalyst for Al Thani to commence on the path which he chose. And he decided that he needed wealth, he needed power, and he needed to secure himself from any and every external threat. But to do all that, he also needed legitimacy. He needed religious legitimacy. This is because modernizing, trying to gain more power through temporal means, would always incur backlash. But he found a solution to this, and he found it within the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, the Muslim Brotherhood then already had an immense, ready-made transnational network of intellectuals, activists, and journalists, and they were already anti-status quo in the Arab world. So, with the Saudi, Emirati, and Egyptian antagonism against him, he turned to their main ideological opponents. But Qatar itself stood for that which the Muslim Brotherhood didn't like, because they were also a traditional monarchy. Essentially, Qatar would offer the Muslim Brotherhood safety, a place of asylum for their exiled leaders, and also a constant stream of cash for various needs and various branches. It could also provide them with a global platform in the form of Al Jazeera. And perhaps most importantly, it seems that Qatar has become a sort of state-institutionalized version of the Muslim Brotherhood. But instead of having the tainted Muslim Brotherhood name, they are instead clean of that. They can operate around the globe through vehicles of the state without the stigma of being the Muslim Brotherhood. That is what I mean when I say they are hand in hand but at arm's length. By aligning itself with the Muslim Brotherhood, but by maintaining plausible deniability, all sides gained the best of both worlds. What the Muslim Brotherhood gave to Qatar was to voluntarily disband themselves within Qatar's borders and not question their authority. And they also were there to legitimize the state's actions. By doing this, they secured a sovereign state's sponsorship for their much larger global project. Both gained. Qatar gained legitimacy, and the Muslim Brotherhood gained a sponsor. And with their interests aligned, each gained when the other gained power. This created a synergistic feedback loop of aligned interests, both in the Middle East and around the world. The main figure from the Muslim Brotherhood, who was Qatar's partner in this project, is the late Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi. Qaradawi was sometimes considered the intellectual head of the Muslim Brotherhood. But he, like Qatar, and for the same reasoning, kept the organization of the Muslim Brotherhood itself at arm's length. This allowed Qaradawi to be both the head of the Muslim Brotherhood, but also be welcomed by Qatar and have plausible deniability. Qaradawi was born Egyptian, but he was granted Qatari citizenship, and he became a state-sponsored cleric. But most importantly, he became the ideological engine which made the entire project theologically valid. Qaradari wasn't just a simple preacher. He was a main figure in modern Islamic jurisprudence, and though while controversial, his thoughts were broadcast around the world in Al Jazeera, and it had a big effect on the Qatari state. Through his writings and sermons, he provided the theological blueprint of how Qatar can operate in a world and how Qatar can execute its long game. To understand this, we need to delve into that Islamic jurisprudence. It is important to note that the Islamic terms I'm using here can have different meanings, whether it be historically or through different modern interpretations. But here I am focusing on Qaradawi's interpretations of those terms. It is also important to note that his interpretations were often new and controversial. While it might be a little reductionist in defining it as such, Qatar's entire blueprint was shielded and defined by Qaradawi's version of a concept of wasatiyah, or the middle way. This term, which literally means balance, is derived from the Quran. However, Qaradawi politically redefined wasatiyah into a cohesive operational ideology. It became a strategic, nonviolent path that accepts modern tools, including democracy, in order to achieve its non-negotiable end goals, which is the long-term global implementation of Sharia. But this is operationalized through a series of specific legal mechanisms, or fiqh. A fiqh is a set of laws surrounding a specific subject, and Qaradawi created and expanded new and novel fiqhs in order to explain and justify his world view. First, there is fiqh al-waqiyah, or the jurisprudence of reality. These are the laws surrounding how Islamic law views reality itself. His interpretation was that Islamic law itself must be adapted to the current geopolitical reality. This one change foundationally changes Islam into something which can be molded to fit the needs of the present. It essentially means that the laws need to fit the modern world as well as Scripture. And when judging upon the laws, you need to take into account what is best and not only what Scripture says. Then there is fiqh al-alwiyat, which is the jurisprudence of priorities. This principle is central to Qatari's plan. What it does is it prioritizes the greater good over the small harms. In Qatar's case, this allows them to do any multitude of small impurities in order to further the large aim of dawah, or converting the entire world. Because gaining influence furthers that goal, any temporary impurity is fine. This goes hand in hand with the principle of at-tadarruj, which is gradualism. It recognizes that Sharia cannot be implemented overnight. It calls for a multi-generational, stage-by-stage process. This is the same way that the Muslim Brotherhood operates. It begins by controlling education, culture, and the media, and then you seek political control. Then there is fiqh al-aqliyat, the jurisprudence of minorities. This mechanism provides a novel way for Muslims living in the West to redefine Islamic practice in order for them to be able to live in the West. What Qaradawi does with it is it instructs them to integrate politically, but not assimilate culturally. This has the goal of establishing Islam in Europe as a powerful, protected voting and lobbying bloc, while maintaining its separateness. In Qaradawi's hands, this weaponizes the West's own democratic freedoms in order to expand Islamic influence within. Most of this is present also within the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood, and they have long championed what is called Tamkeen, or empowerment, which is to gain power through institutional means whenever possible. Now, this was traditionally applied within the Arab Muslim countries. The Muslim Brotherhood would always try to form networks in the different Arab countries, legal networks, school networks, and build up a power base that way, and then gain political power through elections. It was a general strategy and not one that advocated a quick revolution. Through its pact with Qatar and through Qaradawi's jurisprudence, they were able to transplant that strategy and blueprint from traditional Muslim societies onto the broader world and the West. And that is what is meant by the quote I brought earlier by Qaradawi himself, that Islam will conquer Europe without resorting to the sword, and it will do so through dawah, which means that it will proselytize and it will, through power and through infiltrating the state, take control of the West. So Qatar functionally practices a state-run, institutionalized form of Tamkeen that is broadcast to the West. It is a patient, multi-generational goal, and they do so with a wide tool set. Qaradawi was able to provide the legal cover for basically doing whatever it takes to advance this Tamkeen. Fiqh al-Alawiyat, the law of priorities, in Qaradawi's scholarship has been redefined into one of the most important religious obligations. And this ruling dictates that the greater, more enduring good for the Ummah must always be prioritized over the lesser, immediate religious impurities. It means that there's always going to be a cost-benefit analysis when you're going to be undertaking anything. But because of the good of the Ummah, always supersedes any small matter, it is automatically giving a license to do whatever you want in order to gain power, and in doing so, further the goals of the Ummah. Simply, it means that the ends justify the means. But now we need to get into what the means are. And Qaradawi doesn't leave us empty-handed here. Qaradawi also very clearly spells out what the proper form of dawah should be. Before we look at that specifically, we first need to clear up some perceived paradoxes, because this paradox is simply a misunderstanding by the West of the nuances in Islam and the different branches of Islam. In the West, you are almost considered well-read on the subject of Islam if you know that there are Sunnis and there are Shias. But the complexities between the different branches and different schools and different ways of thought and the different strategies within Islam and within each branch of Islam are huge. I can't get into every single nuance here, but I do want to touch upon a key difference between two different strategies in Islam and how that affects how people in the West view Qaradawi, the Muslim Brotherhood, and others. Al-Qaeda and ISIS are both considered part of the Wahhabi school and the Salafi way of thought. There are differences between the two, but it is enough to say that both Al-Qaeda and ISIS promote a violent form of Islam in order to reach their aims. What is important to understand here is that Qaradawi, most of the Muslim Brotherhood, disagree with the violent strategy of Al-Qaeda and ISIS, but they do so mainly for pragmatic and strategic reasons, rather than a fundamental stance against violence. This has led some in the West to view Qaradawi as on the good side, because he has many statements against terrorism. He even said these after September 11th. And people who are looking for a very surface-level understanding of Islam will try to group Muslims into good Muslims and bad Muslims. And they will say that bad Muslims like terrorists, good Muslims don't like terrorists. And here we have a Muslim who is saying that terrorists are bad, i.e., he must be a good Muslim. But this is a very simplistic view, and it overlooks so much nuance as to be irrelevant, especially because Qaradawi himself doesn't eschew terrorism. Famously, he has decreed that suicide bombings in Israel is totally cool, and that jihad against Americans in Iraq is also fine, even though that last judgment he tried to backtrack later. The reason for this is that violent jihad is unacceptable because it doesn't advance the goals of jihad. If it were able to advance the goals, then it was acceptable. Al-Qaeda and ISIS are bad because they are unproductive. They are not strategically sound, not because violence is inherently bad. Essentially, his problem with ISIS and Al-Qaeda is that by killing the infidel in such a blatant manner, you are bringing the wrath of the West upon yourself. Because when you do it like that, the infidel fights back. And that is what led to US intervention in the Middle East. He views it as a mistake because it is the end goal rather than the method which is important. And so he views blatant violence against the West as counterproductive, as not helping the goal. Instead, he advocates that the best method to conquer Rome is through dawah, through peace. He wants to conquer the West, and he probably wouldn't be against doing it with the sword if he thought it was feasible. But since he thinks that it is better to do so through money and through speech, that is the doctrine which he chooses. And this is laid out in a whole book that he wrote called Fiqh al-Jihad, which breaks down his theological views on jihad. But there, he isn't only talking about what we think about when we hear jihad, violent jihad. He spends much of the book talking about jihad al-mal and jihad al-lisan, jihad of the wealth and jihad of speech, because that is the most strategic way in our day to do jihad. So that is the theological framework in a nutshell. I want to go over it one more time before we get into looking how each piece of Qatar's global ambitions fit in. You have Fiqh al-Waqiyah, which says that you make your judgment of what is proper or not by looking also at reality and not just historic Islamic law. You have Fiqh al-Aluriyat, which is the groundwork where the ends justify the means. And so the final goal can justify different actions. You have Tamkeen, which you're looking at a multi-generational process when you're going to try to make change. You have Fiqh al-Alkiliyat, which means that you are allowing the minorities in the West to act differently than they would in Islamic countries in order to gain power but maintain their separate identity. And then you have Jihad al-Mal and Jihad al-Lisan, which are the ways that you will do this. You will gain wealth and you will use your wealth, and you will proselytize with speech and propaganda. With those taken together, Qatar's role in the world becomes much more sharper and focused and clear. This is the strategy on how they are able to invite the infidels to have a military base and how they can do businesses with the infidels in Europe, in London, in America. They can have sporting events and dirty themselves in worldly matters. They have the riches and they have the wealth, and they have everything which is impure for Islam because it is all fine, because their higher aim is quote unquote pure. This is done through a variety of vehicles. The first is a global quest for asset acquisition. Their sovereign wealth fund and other means have invested hundreds of billions of dollars around the world. It has bought symbolic Western assets, luxury London real estate, stakes in the European global banking system. It has bought football clubs. It has invested in infrastructure projects. We don't need to dive into all the detail, but it seems that Qatar's economic interests have no bounds, and the West is eager for that money. They have been slowly selling off key assets to Qatar, part and parcel, over the last decades, and those investments do two things. First, they provide long-term financial independence, safeguarding the state's wealth and their goals from regional conflict, and even perhaps securing their power beyond the hydrocarbon age. But it also does something far more critical. It creates a vast network of codependency. If Qatar comes under pressure, it can activate a powerful, self-interested lobby of banks, real estate tycoons, and major corporations whose profits now depend on Qatar. This is Jihad al-Mal. This is jihad by wealth, where wealth is actively deployed as a political weapon, where it is buying influence, legitimacy, and lobbying. The anchor to this wealth is obviously their liquid natural gas exports. By selling this natural gas to the world, they are generating the means to buy the rest of the world. It sells natural gas and uses the money from the West to buy the West. And with each purchase, it further entrenches itself into the Western system. But Jihad al-Mal doesn't stop there. Israel itself is currently embroiled in a controversy over aides in and around Netanyahu's inner circle being paid by Qatar to advance Qatari interests. If they have succeeded in doing that here in Israel, then what extent is that true in the political circles around the world, where they can shortcut buying the influence the hard way through industry and simply buy politicians and those around them? They have also fully ingrained themselves in the West's interest by diplomatic and security plays. First and foremost is the large U.S. base in the country, the home of CENTCOM. Its purpose is simple. It guarantees their state survival and that the American interest is having their state survive. And it acts as a sort of red line against external aggression by other parties, by dissuading others from attacking them because of the presence of that base. They are then able to pursue a more autonomous foreign policy. But they extend this one step further by inviting everyone else into Qatar, from Iran and Iranian proxies to Turkey. They aim to be quote-unquote neutral mediators for many different conflicts and leverage that into diplomatic power. The only side to which they are not neutral is to that of Qatar itself and the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Muslim Brotherhood's allies and partners such as Hamas. This is perhaps their most dangerous game because they are playing all sides. And by doing so, they can easily become the enemy to all sides. This happened during the Gulf boycott of Qatar and recently when both Israel and Iran attacked targets on Qatari soil. Another of their main vehicles for jihad is Jihad al-Lisan, jihad of the tongue, Al Jazeera. It is through Al Jazeera which they speak to both the wider world and the Arab world. It is through Al Jazeera that they speak to Muslims around the world. They build a platform which many view as indispensable in the Middle East, and they claim neutrality, but in reality, it is for Qatar and Qatari ideology, and that same ideology which is aligned with the Muslim Brotherhood. But much like the Muslim Brotherhood with Al Jazeera, they also keep it at arm's length, but hand in hand. By maintaining plausible deniability that Al Jazeera is not state-controlled, they allow it to undertake more aggressive stances. So, similar to the Muslim Brotherhood, it is advantageous for everyone involved for them to actually be independent from one another, as long as they maintain that their interests are aligned. Then you get the best of both worlds. Al Jazeera can support any cause that helps the cause, and Qatar can maintain plausible deniability. And Al Jazeera was one of the main vehicles for Qaradawi to spread his word around the world. And he was there as a featured lecturer for years, beamed straight into the Islamic homes everywhere, in the Middle East and in the heart of Europe. And so Al Jazeera can support the Muslim Brotherhood around the world as it did during the Arab Spring, while Qatar was somewhat able to deny involvement. But there is also a parallel group of structures, which are Islamic in nature and not secular. They are there to support the Islamic minorities in Europe, to advance the Fiqh al-Aqliyat, There is an Islamic form of jihad al-mal in the building of mega mosques in Europe and America, and by buying cultural centers within universities in order to get Islamic study departments aligned with their particular view of Islam. And it is doing so not just for power, but so they can use that power to advance their goals. It funds the houses of learning in Europe so that the Muslims of Europe will not be integrated into European society, but to be set in this Muslim Brotherhood ideology. It creates power structures within immigrant communities in Europe so that no politician will go against their aims. And if they do, they have the political clout and economic clout to have others come and pressure them. This political power in the West is no longer theoretical. In the recent war between Hamas and Israel, they activated that power to bring people into the streets and to influence the governments of the West to bend to Qatari and Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas ideology. This is in essence the core of how Fiqh al-Aqliyat seeks power. They gain more and more power in society, but don't integrate into that society. And by having the preachers all around Europe and teaching in those Qatari-funded mosques, having learned and being associated with Qaradawi-led institutions, this is also a form of jihad al-lisan. And their money is buying Western education in order to raise generations of Westerners on Qatari beliefs. And while doing so, they can always paint themselves as moderates because at the end of the day, they are against Al-Qaeda, they are against ISIS, they promote peace. They are taking advantage of the freedoms of the West to destroy the ideals of the West. It is in a way ideologically ironclad. They have built a pragmatic Islam with Qaradawi's jurisprudence, which can explain every contradiction, dot every I, cross every T. Everything it does is holy because power feeds power, and power itself might not be the aim, but it is the vehicle of transmission of Islam, of bringing Islam into every corner of Europe and the West and the world. Qatar has built themselves an empire focused on one goal, and it is a strong empire, and it is a large empire. But I also think that this empire is a house of cards. It is mainly built on soft power. And this distinction is critical. Today, we must not confuse codependency of specific actors in the West with the objective power of the state. Qatar has successfully captured a layer of elites, the bankers, the real estate moguls, the university administrators, politicians perhaps, who now depend on that flow of capital. But these actors are not the nation. The sovereign state still possesses the ultimate authority to dismantle these networks through law and reclassification. Yes, pulling this plug would come at a detriment to those specific compromised actors. It would hurt the lobbies and the balance sheets of the few. But that momentary pain may be necessary for the broader gain of national survival. Qatar's house of cards stands only as long as the West continues to mistake the profits of its elite for the interests of its people. Governments around the world could simply reclassify the Muslim Brotherhood, but not only the Muslim Brotherhood, also the Qatari-funded institutions which are aligned, but not technically part of the Muslim Brotherhood, as promoting terror and ban them. They can outlaw them because of what they are doing, because they are trying to fundamentally change the state and the people in those countries. It is not too late for the West to decide that its society is worth saving. But of course, to do that, they must reject the bribes. They must reject the temptations. They must reject the infinite flow of Qatari money, which can fill all the coffers around the world. But if there are enough good men around the world to say no, our future is not for sale. We will not allow you to buy us into submission when you couldn't take us by the sword. Then there is hope yet. It is a vast and powerful empire, but one which is completely reliant on the West's quiet acquiescence to servitude. One strong gust of political wind can bring it all crashing down. It is up to you and everyone else to decide what future the West wants for itself. Again, this is causality. The news reports the symptoms, we provide the diagnosis. And in this case, I have also supplied a prognosis. I think the analysis here in this video is important, and if you agree, help spread it by sharing this video with the people who need to hear it, by following me on X and retweeting my posts on this video. Let us spread this message and wake up the West. Until next time, take care.